to us by this Friday. So make sure that you get that turned in. And that's all we have for announcements. So we've got with us Dr. Kynes, Dr. Will Kynes, here digitally today. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia, got his bachelor's there, did an MDiv here at Southern, and then went to St. Andrews to do an MLit and then a PhD at the University of Cambridge under the supervision of Catherine Dell. I didn't get a chance to ask you, did you edit that Ecclesiastes, reading Ecclesiastes intertextually, did you edit that book with her?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I thought I recognized your name from that. So he taught at Oxford and then at Whitworth University before coming to Samford. Is this your first semester, right?
My first semester at Samford, yes.
Okay, excellent. And so he's written a number of books. His dissertation, My Psalmist Turned into Weeping, Job's Dialogue with the Psalms, earned international recognition and was awarded the Manfred Lautenschlager. Is that how you say that? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
Schlager. Yeah.
Yeah. Schlager?
Yeah.
Okay. And his next monograph, An Obituary for Wisdom Literature, The Birth, Death, and Intertextual Reintegration of a Biblical Corpus, is coming out. Has it been released yet?
Yeah, it was released in the U.S. in March of this year.
Okay, great. So that's available for us after we hear this lecture from you today to go and pick up. So, Dr. Kynes is an alum of this institution. We're so grateful that you made the time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure, to be here with us, and we're really looking forward to what you have to say. So, take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Trey, for the invitation to both you and Dr. Pennington. I'm sorry you can't be here, but that gives me an opportunity to embarrass him a little bit without him in the room.
Okay.
Southern was a great experience for me and formative in many ways, but one of the most formative experiences for me was getting to take classes with Dr. Pennington. I mean, he formed me to such a degree that I ended up following in his footsteps to go to St. Andrews, at least for a year. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to share with you today. I just wish that I was able to share in more happy circumstances. Unfortunately, we're going to be considering death today. You see, the wisdom literature category, a collection of biblical books centered on Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, has died. She was 168 years old. Many were shocked to hear of the death of the category, given that up until quite recently, she had appeared to be in excellent health, having just enjoyed a rocketing rise in popularity and nearly universal agreement on her value for biblical interpretation. Some were also surprised to hear of her relatively young age at death, since her pervasive presence in biblical studies made it difficult to imagine a time when she wasn't around. Many assumed that wisdom was much older. She apparently did not age well. Perhaps they were influenced by the existence of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, texts that resemble Proverbs, such as the Egyptian instruction of Ptah-hotep or the Mesopotamian instructions of Shirapach, and others that resemble Ecclesiastes or Job, such as the Egyptian dialogue between a man and his Ba, or the Mesopotamian dialogue of pessimism. But even though those texts do predate the biblical texts that they are similar to, grouping them all together as wisdom resulted from the scholarly consensus on the biblical wisdom corpus. So it would be illegitimate to look there for its origin. Others assumed that vestiges of the category went all the way back to early Jewish and Christian interpretation. However, as this table demonstrates, none of the ancient literary collections often associated with the modern wisdom category contain the same group of texts, which reflects the differing criteria used to form them. These categories are both quantitatively in terms of the text they include and qualitatively in terms of the criteria used to form them, different than the modern wisdom category. Even Jeremiah 18:18, commonly considered biblical testimony for a wisdom category in ancient Israel, falls short of proving its existence. Though it mentions the counsel of the wise, alongside the instruction of the priest and the word of the prophet, the most that this text would provide is evidence for a specialized meaning for the wise as a class in Israel, not for a group of texts. However, parallel construction in Ezekiel 7:26, where the elders replace the wise, suggests that the wise in Jeremiah 18:18 simply characterizes anyone who has attained wisdom, as could be assumed of the elders. And that's how the word is generally used in the Hebrew Bible, often in contrast with the fool, which is certainly not intended to indicate a particular social group within Israel. The wisdom category does not appear, therefore, to be an ancient tradition. In fact, the category's origins were hitherto uncertain. She was born beyond the borders of current knowledge in one of the gray areas of scholarship. Wisdom was an orphan then, both because she appeared to resemble foreign forebears from the ancient Near East more than her canonical kin, but also because her parentage was unknown. Now, a few scholars have attempted to identify the category's origins in biblical scholarship, selecting dates such as 1908 or even as early as 1891. However, I've found references to the category that appear in both English and German scholarship throughout the latter half of the 19th century. And if you look at the back of your handout, I have this laid out for you. I know it's kind of small here. The footnotes in all of these references in the 19th century all lead back to one book that was published in 1851, Weisheitslehre der Hebräer, or Wisdom Teaching of the Hebrews, which was written by Johann Bruch. Now, examining the earlier works to which Bruch himself refers, three significant details stand out. First, none of them have a clear conception of wisdom as a separate category of biblical books consisting of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and amongst the deuterocanonical works, Ben Sira and Wisdom of Solomon, as Bruch and the vast majority of those who mention the category after him do. Bruch, therefore, appears to be the father of wisdom. Second, though Bruch is the earliest to present the wisdom category systematically and comprehensively, he does draw heavily on a group of earlier scholars. Third, those earlier scholars are each strongly influenced by prominent philosophical ideas of the early 19th century. They mention philosophers such as Fries, Herder, Schleiermacher, Feuerbach, and Hegel. It appears that if biblical scholarship in the form of Johann Bruch was wisdom's father, then post-Enlightenment continental philosophy was her mother. Bruch's work, which is subtitled A Contribution to the History of Philosophy, makes this lineage clear. Explicitly addressing an audience of both theologians and philosophers, Bruch begins by defending the study of the Old Testament to a philosophical audience through disputing the allegation that the Hebrew people lacked any philosophical efforts, despite the omission of the Hebrews from histories of philosophy at his time. Bruch says that the breath of a non-theocratic spirit blows in the Old Testament, which found no satisfaction in the religious institutes of the nation, and therefore found another way through free thought in the exploration of difficult questions in pursuit of peace of mind. And that spirit that he describes combines many of the philosophical ideas that the biblical scholars who influenced Bruch had themselves imbibed as they served as a collective womb for wisdom's gestation. The circumstances of wisdom's birth, then, explain a great deal about the category's controversial existence. In themselves, they do not doom her, but the convenient appearance of wisdom literature to meet the demands of the time calls for more careful scrutiny than it has previously received. Timing and location of the category's origin are certainly suspicious. In 19th century Germany, Christians were struggling to reconcile the universalistic, humanistic, and philosophical aspects of their religion with its particularistic connection with an Israelite history that was becoming increasingly problematic under the intense examination of 18th century rationalism and 19th century historical criticism. And this was fertile soil in which wisdom might sprout. As in Franz Stielitz's words at the time, the universalistic, humanistic, philosophical collection within the Old Testament, independent of Israel's particularistic theocracy, cult, and law. Now, Delitzsch adopted the wisdom category from Bruch, whom he acknowledged was the first to call special attention to the chokhmah, or humanism, as a particular or a peculiar intellectual tendency in Israel. But, Delitzsch claimed, Bruch was mistaken in placing it in an indifferent and even hostile relation to the national law and the national cultus, which, Delitzsch claims, Bruch compares to the relation of Christian philosophy to Orthodox theology. The development of wisdom literature would appear then to be the equivalent in Old Testament theology of Schleiermacher's On Religion, which similarly attempts to defend Christianity to its cultured despisers. It's difficult not to see this as another example of 19th century scholars looking into the well and seeing their own reflection, though this is an interpretive tendency from which scholars of other centuries, even our own, are not immune. Despite her later success, the wisdom category was never able to escape the effects of this troubled upbringing, becoming, in Clement's words, a rather errant child in the Hebrew Bible. As her popularity grew, so did her struggles with identity. Bruch had brought this group of texts together on the basis of their purported philosophical interests and independence from the rest of the canon in Israelite religion. Naturally, these themes continually reemerged as scholarly reflection on Israelite wisdom developed. And over time, the distinctive nature of wisdom only increased. Interest in wisdom has swung back and forth like a pendulum over the last century and a half. At first, she was ignored so pervasively that, as mentioned earlier, most have completely overlooked her existence in the 19th century. In 1924, however, she got her big break when close parallels between Proverbs and the Egyptian instruction of Amenemope were discovered. Suddenly, she was the belle of the biblical studies ball, as a deluge of research ensued. After World War II, however, this new darling of biblical studies fell into disfavor. The enthusiasm for finding connections between biblical wisdom texts and those from the ancient Near East became a liability when the biblical theology movement brought the theological significance of Israelite history and Hebrew thought to the fore. She was called pagan and a foreign body in the Old Testament, and she suffered the fate of one who is insufficiently Hebraic at a time when a premium is placed on Hebrew thought, as Murphy said. So over the course of the 1960s, however, that emphasis on Israelite history that had marginalized wisdom eventually fell into disfavor itself. So perhaps due to a new appreciation for wisdom's universalism, her relationship with the rest of the canon swung to the opposite pole, as studies on the purported wisdom influence proliferated. And according to these studies, wisdom played a formative role in books across the canon, including the primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11, the Joseph narrative, Exodus, Deuteronomy, the succession narrative, Esther, the historical books as a whole, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Amos, Jonah, and Habakkuk. Wisdom, once disregarded, now gained new prominence, inspiring Roland Murphy to ask, where has Old Testament wisdom failed to appear? As James Crenshaw put it, this special orphan became queen for a day, perhaps even queen mother. Now, Crenshaw was concerned about the rapid and extensive spread of wisdom's influence across the canon, but his attempts to stop her by restricting the definition of wisdom only to the commonly accepted wisdom books have ultimately failed. The diverse contents of even that limited wisdom corpus have consistently given attempts to define its distinctive features a certain instability, characterized by vague, abstract, and potentially all-encompassing definitions, such as Murphy's, which identifies those wisdom books by their shared intellectual approach to reality, which is broad enough to make all literature wisdom literature. In recent years, the definitional dam that Crenshaw constructed started to crumble, and wisdom began to rush across the canon again. She was once again wearing her party dress, as Stuart Weeks puts it. Crenshaw had circularly attempted to use the traditional wisdom texts to limit the definition of which texts could be labeled wisdom. But this more recent approach's start in that traditional consensus, the justification for which scholars are increasingly recognizing to be problematic, leaves it without a way to end, apart from a circular appeal back to that same original consensus. Thus, the consensus itself on the definition of wisdom literature as a category appears to be the problem. A broad discomfort with the marginalization of wisdom from the rest of the Old Testament and its theology led not so much to a theologization of wisdom in scholarship as to a sapientialization of Old Testament theology, as scholars increasingly began to understand the entire Old Testament through the lens of wisdom. So Catherine Dale claims, the richness and diversity of wisdom and the extent of its influence lead one to suspect that wisdom's proper place is at the heart of the Israelite experience of God. Richard Clifford says, rather than wisdom books influencing other biblical books, however, it's more likely that wisdom thinking was in the mainstream of biblical literary production, from whence its style and ideas radiated throughout biblical writings. David Carr says, in the beginning was the writing-supported teaching of the wise. Mark Sneed, these same Israelite wisdom writers or scribal scholars, in addition to producing the wisdom literature, were involved in the preservation, composition, utilization, and instruction of the other literary genres of the Hebrew Bible. And then just last year, Dewald Dryden said, the whole of the Hebrew Bible can fit under the umbrella of wisdom, with all biblical genres as subgenres of wisdom. In his book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, Yoram Hazony takes Bruch's efforts to their natural end as he, quote, looks forward to a time when most of the Hebrew Bible, if not all of it, will be recognized as wisdom literature. And if current trends continue, he may not have to wait long. Wisdom threatens to conquer the entire canonical corpus. She had been born with two vocations: to shed new light on these opaque biblical books in the ancient Israelite world from which they came, and to carve out some part of the Hebrew Bible that would be palatable in a post-Enlightenment age. As she developed, however, these callings came into conflict. She became more distinctive from the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and then she began to shape the rest of the canon into her image as more and more texts, and then finally the basic Israelite worldview as a whole were associated with wisdom. Interpreters found, quote, something attractive, end quote, about wisdom, even if they could not quite identify it. Thus, Crenshaw observes, since its identification as a separate category, wisdom has stood largely as a mirror image of the scholar painting her portrait. And John Collins adds, biblical interpreters have demonstrated a tendency to apply the wisdom label to any form of knowledge that is recognized as good, which often has a striking similarity to the knowledge those scholars themselves most value. For example, though Stuart Weeks denies that wisdom arose as the products of an academic discipline per se, he claims that, quote, we do not look far afield to find the same sort of phenomenon. So, starting with what some admit is the presumption or assumption of a subjective nature, that a category primarily composed of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job exists, interpreters find it difficult to identify what Crenshaw calls the mysterious ingredient that holds it together. But perhaps that's not because the category is so foreign and obscure, but because it is so familiar and clear. Views of what is good have not changed that much since the category originated in the 19th century. It's little surprise that these vague, abstract features of wisdom, such as didactic emphasis, humanistic interest, or focus on creation, knowledge that is currently recognized as good, may be found in so many other texts, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the ancient Near East. With little concrete evidence, either literarily or historically, to hinder its spread, the wisdom category has had the power increasingly to transform the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern texts into its reflective image. Now, though an etic imposed category is not necessarily problematic, it becomes so when it creates a new center of gravity for a group of texts, drawing them away from the rich variety of their original context towards its ill-defined, circularly justified, modernly developed, and extrinsically imposed presuppositions. Even as wisdom was expanding in the 1960s, however, Gerhard von Rad recognized the category's inherent weakness as a scholarly invention, and therefore something that could be more of a hindrance than a help in interpreting its contents. Though von Rad went on to preserve the category, he warned of the uncritical use of this collective term and its potential for suggesting something which never existed, and thereby dangerously prejudicing the interpretation of varied material. Recently, such fundamental questions about the category have begun to be raised with a new urgency. Was there, in fact, a wisdom tradition? What are the boundaries of wisdom? Is the wisdom literature category useful? And you notice the scare quotes around wisdom in the titles of each of these articles, which demonstrate the waning scholarly confidence in the category. As the questions mount, von Rad's worries are becoming increasingly validated. The time, it appears, has come to declare wisdom dead. Despite its weaknesses, wisdom will be survived by the benefits it has generated: an increased interest in the concept of wisdom in the Bible and across the ancient Near East, and a widespread appreciation for the three so-called wisdom books. Wisdom's legacy, then, will depend on the place given her heirs by future biblical interpreters. Her life depended on closely uniting the concept of wisdom and a growing throng of associated ideas such as creation theology, universalism, empiricism, and individualism, with the other, a specific group of texts. But the category's death frees the concept of wisdom and the so-called wisdom texts so that they can go out on their own to be understood more independently from one another. Without the category setting common boundaries for both, the concept of wisdom can be understood with resources beyond these texts, and the message of these texts can transcend wisdom. And this will demonstrate the interdependence of the wisdom texts, so-called, and other biblical texts across the canon and beyond. All are interwoven in a vast, intricate web of meaning. After all, according to Karl Popper, things may be similar in different respects. And any two things which are from one point of view similar may be dissimilar from another point of view. And thus, as genre theorist John Frau observes, all texts are relevantly similar to some texts and relevantly dissimilar to others. Different approaches to genre handle this potential surplus of meaning these various relationships create in different ways. Now, biblical studies has long perpetuated a realist approach to genre, which takes this complex textual network and carves it into exclusive, non-overlapping categories, non-overlapping genre classifications, so that a text either is wisdom or is not. And this traditional taxonomic approach overemphasizes both the similarity with some texts within the genre and the difference with others outside of the genre, placing groups of texts in distorting echo chambers. Now, recognizing the marginalizing effect that this approach has had on wisdom literature, the recent pan-sapiential response has emphasized similarity to the detriment of difference, and has thereby flattened out textual diversity. Seeing her fading health and acknowledging that wisdom cannot be justified according to a taxonomic understanding of genre, scholars have proposed more pliant and permeable approaches that maintain a distinct biblical wisdom category while giving it more fuzzy boundaries. But by keeping the category on life support with these flexible definitions, these approaches only risk spreading the pan-sapiential virus. An individualistic approach, though, which attempts to dismiss genre groupings altogether and interpret each group individually and independently, would make the opposite mistake, emphasizing difference over similarity. And would actually be practically impossible, since text cannot be understood without some kind of comparison with other texts. So responding to this view, David Fischerloff, another genre theorist, argues that, quote, no matter how fervently an author claims that his text is unique, it still has intimate links with existing types of literature, i.e. with literary genres. However, Fischerloff has created a false disjunction, and it's important for understanding the theory of genre I'm going to propose. A text's unique character need not be set against its links with other types of literature, since every text will relate differently with other texts and therefore involve a unique set of intimate links with existing types of literature. So as a result, genres are better understood not as taxonomic categories, but as dynamic groupings through which readers recognize that one text is similar to a group of other texts in respect to one or more significant characteristics. And biblical scholars have begun to recognize the ways that genres overlap in texts, but they have yet to integrate this insight with the contribution of historical and cultural perspectives like the 19th century German context in which wisdom was conceived. So to conceptualize this, a metaphor may help, as they often do in genre theory. So genres can be envisioned as constellations of texts, an imaginary way of representing real relationships that trace out zones of reading in the sky in the same way that stars can be grouped together based on images that draw them together, like we have Orion here. Readers group texts together according to some significant pattern of meaning they perceive them to share. Now, Friedrich Schlegel claims, however, that the traditional taxonomic approach is pre-Copernican, since it assumes, quote, whatever somebody is capable of producing, whatever happens to be in fashion, is the stationary earth at the center of all things, from which we perceive these connections between texts. So genres in this understanding are drawn on the two-dimensional firmament viewed from that single perspective. But the stars, however, are actually spread across 3 dimensions of space, not 2. So that means that, as figure 5 in your handout in this video show, stars that appear relatively close together from an earthly vantage point may in fact be much farther apart. The anthropomorphic relationship between the stars that form the Orion constellation would disappear if those stars were viewed from elsewhere in the universe. Then new relationships between Orion stars and others in the sky would emerge. So, as the ancestry, birth, life, and death of wisdom demonstrate, the way we constellate texts changes as a function of history through the changing perspectives of individual critics. Therefore, instead of being limited to the stationary view from a single 19th century perspective, in which a universalistic, humanistic, philosophical conception of wisdom is at the center of all things, as Schlegel would say, the relevant affinities revealed by other perspectives should also be considered. The conception of wisdom teaching that united Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job for scholars such as Bruch, therefore, should not be taken as the only or even necessarily the main topic with which the 3 books are concerned. I would propose then imagining the network of texts in 3 dimensions rather than 2, as in figure 6 on your handout, where we imagine another text, the Psalms, above this network, creating a pyramid-like shape, which we can then view from different points of view. So wisdom connects the bottom texts in the pyramid, but if we look at the right side of the pyramid over here, we can see Job, Psalms, and Ecclesiastes, which De Wette argued together pointed to the form of Unglück, or the importance of Unglück, or misfortune, in Hebrew thought. And this was before wisdom literature had come along. He saw those texts creating a significant affinity between one another. But we can also look at the other side of that pyramid, where Proverbs, Psalms, and Job are grouped together. And this is an ancient Jewish way of grouping texts together called the Sifrei Emet. And we don't have clear evidence why those three texts are grouped together, but once we look at them together, we can notice significant things about the text, such as the fact that Job is in between Psalms and Proverbs and shares significant affinities with each of them. And all three texts emphasize this dichotomy between righteousness and wickedness. And it's this type of intertextual work, looking at texts from various intertextual angles, that Catherine Dell and I have been trying to encourage by editing this series of 3 books, reading Job intertextually, reading Ecclesiastes intertextually, and reading Proverbs intertextually. So each of these approaches considers different similarities between the texts relevant. And by viewing the text within these overlapping groupings, this approach to genre would provide a fuller appreciation of their meaning by more accurately triangulating their location in relationship to other texts. So let's look at Ecclesiastes, for example, because it appears in several of the textual constellations that we've just mentioned: wisdom, misfortune, Solomonic, and poetic, each which reveals different salient features of the text, whether that's the book's interest in wisdom, according to Brooks' reading, the agonized search for meaning that De Wette sees in it, or the royal garb of its reflections, according to the Solomonic collection, or its formal characteristics in the poetic collection. These genre constellations do not exist without the recognition of the particular relationship that Ecclesiastes has to separate patterns of different textual stars in the literary sky. But interpreting the book fully requires these 4 patterns of textual meaning to be blended together. The book's meaning is more than any one genre grouping can comprehend, but that meaning cannot be comprehended without genre groupings. So similarly, this approach would also illuminate the meaning of Job by taking into account the various genre proposals that have been made for that book across the history of interpretation, which is not limited to wisdom literature. In fact, wisdom literature only begins with Brooke. Other genre proposals such as lament, lawsuit, meta-prophecy, parody have also been suggested for that text. And understanding it fully would involve integrating those proposals and others which abound. As Crenshaw writes of Job, like all great literary works, this one rewards readers who come to it from vastly different starting points. And that's precisely the type of approach that I'm advocating here. Now, Proverbs has this great emphasis on wisdom, which guarantees that wisdom will be a main topic in any interpretation of the book. But whatever the other texts that are included in one's interpretation are going to affect how that wisdom is understood. And the wisdom classification directs readers' attention away from, rather than toward, the nuance and complexity of both the text of Proverbs and the concept of wisdom that it describes. And we could pay attention to other collections that Proverbs appears in, such as Sifrei Emet again, or the Poetry collection, which underscores the frequently overlooked contribution of the book's poetic form to its message, or the Solomonic collection, which connects Proverbs and Song of Songs. We could also pay attention to the ways that Proverbs connects itself to Solomon, and therefore connects itself to the description of Solomon's wisdom in 1 Kings 1-11, which includes political, legal, and even cultic acumen, and therefore invites Proverbs to be grouped with other texts that demonstrate those interests as well. Deuteronomy would be the prime one to consider. So much work remains to be done, but significantly, when mapping the intertextual networks surrounding these texts in this way, wisdom as a concept is used to identify certain affiliations between texts, but that concept is not defined on the basis of that limited set of texts which are chosen. Wisdom is only one feature that contributes to the understanding of each text. Each is more than merely a wisdom text. And so the word wisdom has returned to the orbit of other concepts in the Israelite worldview, such as righteousness or holiness. This classification, long considered absolute and exclusive of wisdom literature, has instead become relative and partial. Wisdom takes with her to her grave an extensive conceptual and paratextual apparatus, a purported ancient Israelite movement, and current scholarly and publishing conventions that cordon off the so-called wisdom books and those who wrote them and continue to write about them from the rest of the canon. Even as constructs, genres can have these types of real effects in the world as they shape readers' expectations, which makes their uncritical use hermeneutically dangerous. Wisdom, however, is just one of many genre groupings responding to shared affinity between these texts and others. It may be a genre, but it is not the genre of these texts. They are not wisdom literature in any definitive categorical sense that would justify the assumption that they were composed in a separate school with a distinctive theology that requires its own introductions, experts, and conference sessions. At least not any more than grouping texts based on their interests in other concepts, such as righteousness or holiness, would. As the wisdom corpus is laid to rest in the dust, the network of canonical constitutive elements from which she came, she will reintegrate, as bodies do, into those same elements. From canon she was, and to canon she will return. After the death of the wisdom literature category, it's through this intertextual reintegration that both the concept of wisdom and the texts associated with it will be reborn. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Kynes, if it's all right, I'm going to ask a couple of questions before opening it up.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So the first, thank you. This is all really good and give me a lot to think about. How do you think about the imitation of literary forms that you see within, say, Proverbs, and then is picked up by Ben Sira or Songs of Solomon with the Psalms? Does that indicate that these kind of preconceived, standards of literature and how to write, that at least in the minds of the people who imitated them, are some set form of writing that we could talk about as genre today, as a metaphor for what it is? Just the thought that came to me. I was interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. And others have raised exactly this question, and I think it's a really helpful one, so thank you, because I think it helps to distinguish what I'm trying to argue from what I'm not trying to argue, which is what I want to encourage us to do is pay attention to these significant affinities between texts within the Old Testament and even beyond the Old Testament, and notice those similarities between them. So yes, there are significant similarities between Proverbs and Ben Sira and other ancient Near Eastern texts that come before Proverbs in terms of the instructional form. What I'm arguing against is taking that genre that you've identified, that significant affinity, and then mashing it into the wisdom literature category and suddenly making that mean way more than we can draw from those affinities, right? What you've identified as similarities between Proverbs and Ben Sira, that doesn't say anything about Job. It doesn't say anything about humanism, universalism, rationalism, empiricism, all of those other ideas that have been imported onto the category. So what I want us to do is be able to speak a bit more precisely about what we're actually doing when we notice these kinds of similarities. And one of the ways that that becomes really relevant, I think, when it comes to our interpretation of the book of Proverbs is, I think if you're going to define a instruction genre, then I would include Deuteronomy in there because of the ways that it's also trying to instruct and the similarities between Deuteronomy and Proverbs 1-9. But one of the reasons why Deuteronomy doesn't get included in that genre, if you were going to create it, is because it's so interested with other questions like covenant and the history of Israel that are excluded from wisdom literature because of the ways that wisdom literature is defined. So I think by being a little more careful about how we think about genre, we can more accurately interpret texts without imposing other things on them, but also without limiting other connections with other texts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Kind of the second follow-up I had to this, in terms of the Christian canon, obviously there's been a lot of different ways that what has been labeled wisdom literature, right, that has been read. So thinking about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs representing the ascent of the soul as it grows in godliness. Are there any, or should there be any guardrails to those kind of constructions within canonical readings of these texts? And if so, what are they? Does that question make sense?
So what do you mean by guardrails?
Just, I mean, from your perspective, is there a better way to read these texts canonically than others?
Yeah. So one distinction that I'll make, and it might anticipate another question that someone will raise, because it's one that I often receive, is, well, what about Torah and prophecy? Those seem to be genres that the canon itself gives to us.
Right.
And I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but I would say that there's an important distinction between imic genre categories and etic ones. So imic ones are ones that come from within the time of the writing of the text, and etic ones are ones that are imposed on the text from outside of that culture. And the history of the canon obviously is a complex one, but we can at least say that the collection of the Torah goes back a lot farther than wisdom literature. Wisdom literature doesn't appear, I've searched as much as I can. I cannot find a wisdom, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes grouped together before the mid-19th century. So I think that the canon, actually, one of the things that I do in the book is I look at a lot of different canon lists. I didn't have the benefit of John Mead's recent collection, because it came out right as my book was going to publication. But that kind of work is really helpful, because I think it gives us some insight into the instincts of ancient readers. If they're putting texts together in various ways, it's because they're seeing similarities between them in some ways rather than others. And I want to pay attention to that. We can't always understand exactly what they were thinking. They're not always explicit with us about the justification for that. But just by putting those groups together, like I talked about with the Sifrei Emet, or we could do with the Solomonic collection, as you just suggested, they can reveal significant affinities between the texts that help us to understand them in fuller ways.
Thank you. Just one final question. I know you read her obituary at the beginning of the presentation, but do you think practically wisdom will, as a category, in our minds and in the minds of the people of the church, will ever go away? Do you think it's going to stay, or?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who think that I'm fighting quite a losing battle here, but some encouraging signs. I've been contacted by a couple of professors who have reorganized the way that they teach their introductions to the Bible or their introductions to the Old Testament. And I do the same thing. So I no longer have a class period on wisdom literature and group the text together. So that change may be coming. And I think the fact that people have started putting the scare quotes on wisdom literature is another indication. Also, the fact that there are an increasing number of articles trying to defend wisdom literature. Now, if you're writing an article defending the existence of a concept, that's not a strong endorsement for its vitality. So there are some hints that we may be going in that direction. But another thing I want to be clear about is that I think there's value in comparing Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. I think that they do talk about wisdom more than other texts. What I want to push back against is only seeing them that way, right? Categorizing that way exclusively. So I think one of the ways to diffuse the power of wisdom literature is not necessarily to throw it out altogether, but to add next to it a number of other different ways to group texts together in order to draw insight from them.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions?
Dr. Kynes, is this a distillation of your recent publication, or is this like the follow-up to it?
So this is a distillation. So since you're here, you just saved yourself $80 since it's an IUP book. Yeah, so this pretty much summarizes what I argue in the book. I'm going to be giving a paper at SBL, kind of developing on this a little bit, and I'm actually currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Wisdom and Wisdom Literature. And there, I'm writing an introduction where I'm trying to develop a little bit more this idea that I tried to get at the end of this paper, which is I think I want to encourage people to think about what wisdom means in the Bible in a way that's more independent of all of the presuppositions we have about wisdom literature. And that's where I'd like to see things go on one hand, and on the other hand would be paying more attention to connections between the so-called wisdom books and other texts across the canon. And there are other people that I know of who are doing more of that kind of work, which I would love to see continue.
Thank you very much.
Aaron?
Yeah. Dr. Kynes, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask about the relationship between the system Laban and form criticism, which is very tied to the kind of genre analysis that you've discussed. So in this new approach, how would that affect the historical element of interpretation?
Yeah, so if I was going to write an obituary for anything else, it would be for form criticism. I think that form criticism is a very unhelpful approach to biblical scholarship. And I think it's built on a very weak foundation in Gunkel's understanding of what genre is. It's built very much on this older taxonomic approach of genre where for it to work, you have to identify a genre to which a text belongs so that you can connect that genre to one specific historical context, one specific Zitzim Leben in the ancient world. But that's just not the way that texts work. Ancient authors will mix together various genres. They'll imitate genres. They'll parody a genre. And so I think that Gunkel is trying to make things in order to draw the historical information he's trying to draw from the text, he has to make things way more simple than they actually are. And but I think it distorts our understanding both of the texts and of the ancient world, and therefore is really unhelpful. I mean, I'll just give you one example, which I think is the prime example of where things can go. So Psalm 73, some people will see that as a wisdom psalm because it has similarities to Job, but it also has been interpreted as a thanksgiving psalm. So in terms of its form, it seems somewhat mixed. So how do we explain that? Well, one scholar, I think his name was Ross, in the 1970s argued that, well, the author of this psalm, he went to a wisdom school near the temple, and then he went to the temple on the same day, and then he wrote Psalm 73. So it was a result of a mixing of these two Zitzim Leben, or Zitza im Leben, at once. And I just think that's the kind of argument that form criticism forces you into, which it just doesn't seem to reflect either the way that texts work or the way that the ancient world worked.
So for example, what would you say is the historical setting of the book of Proverbs?
Yeah, well, I think that Proverbs is probably drawing on a wide range of historical settings. I mean, it addresses a wide range of settings in life just on itself. I mean, you've got within it some proverbs that are addressed towards what seems to be a royal context, other proverbs that are addressed towards everyday life. So I don't think the problem with form criticism is it attempts to jump from literary form to historical information. And it's trying to we have a problem when we read the biblical text, which is we don't have a whole lot of historical information beyond the biblical text itself. So we've got to try and somehow squeeze historical information out of that biblical text by looking at the literary nature of the text. But I think that what it's led to in biblical scholarship is illegitimate conclusions that make a text like Proverbs seem simpler than it is. So people feel like they have to make a decision about one particular setting in life that the text came from, and I think it's broader than that. So yeah, it's what ends up happening, and is, and I say this in the book, but I don't say it here, is we do, using this genre approach, we lose the ability to say some things about the historical world behind the text. But I would rather say less with more confidence than more on an illegitimate foundation. And part of what biblical scholarship in the past has done, and particularly in the 19th century, is said a lot without much of a strong foundation.
So would this approach then focus on the world within the text?
Yes, I think, yeah, I think it would focus more on the world within the text, because that's what we have access to. It also would focus more on the world in front of the text in terms of the history of the text interpretation, and say that as people have read the text throughout the centuries, they've noticed certain things about its meaning that we should pay more attention to, rather than pretend like nothing happened in biblical interpretation between the writing of the text and the 19th century, when historical criticism came along and identified definitively that these texts come from a quote unquote wisdom school in ancient Israel that was attached to the court and so forth and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Yep, Nick.
So I was trying to link up your approaches to genre, your diagrams on the bottom of, I guess that's page 2 on the front. And I was thinking about figure 5 versus figure 2, the taxonomic. And I'm just trying to see the distinction between them. What we see flat in the sky, and it looks like it's kind of a taxonomic idea, seeing the similarities, and then you can shift to a different viewpoint and see the similarities according to the video that you showed, like you look at it from the side. So am I understanding like figure 5 is to say you can do taxonomic comparisons, but from multiple angles? Is that what you're getting at, or is it something dramatically different from that?
No, yeah, that's exactly it. So what I'm arguing is figure 5 is trying to show we are tempted to talk about the Orion constellation as if that is where those stars are. In fact, the American Astronomical Society uses Orion to identify the locations of those stars in the sky. But they know that the sky is actually in 3 dimensions, which means that if you were looking at the stars in Orion from elsewhere in the universe, you would group them together in a different way. So what I'm saying is that it's like you're doing that genre work in figure 2 over and over again from different perspectives. And each of those different perspectives would lead you to group those texts with other different texts, and therefore lead you to notice different significant features of that text. So yes, you're right. I think you've described it exactly. The crucial distinction is that, and what I'm proposing, you don't stop with the one definitive genre. Instead, you keep going and noticing other groupings.
Okay, I have a question.
Yep.
Hey, Will, Dominic Hernandez here. How you doing, brother?
Hey, Dominic.
First of all, you look great from what I could see of you.
Thanks, buddy.
Also, man, really appreciated the presentation. Seriously, you should know that my students in Exegesis of Proverbs class next semester will have to buy your $80 book.
Oh, okay. Encouraged to hear that.
Version. I just discouraged everyone from taking that class, I think. But no, really, I learned a lot from this presentation, and obviously familiar with what there was in tradition, the book that you mentioned a few times in the presentation. Just wanted to ask this question that I sort of heard you talk about a little bit, but maybe not so much. You know, from what I understand with regard to the grouping, this wisdom literature, this genre, is that it's not necessarily the genre wasn't necessarily formed because of what's written just what's written per se, or even how it's written per se, but that there were certain rhetorical devices and literary devices that were encouraging the audience to think about certain types of things, whether it be philosophically or theologically. So, and we see this obviously in the ancient areas, right, where there are, the documents that are encouraging people to think about righteous suffering. That's a very easy example. And so sort of how I understood things, at least from one perspective, was that there's a series of Venn diagrams, right? Where there's, okay, so this is this composition, and this is trying to get people to think about X, Y, and Z. And then there's this composition which is trying to get people to think about, maybe X and Y. And sort of they overlap. And by the time you have all these documents from the ancient Near East that sort of fit under this wisdom category that are probably written in poetry in their respective Semitic languages, you have a group at least of topics that these documents are trying to get their readers to think about in a certain way. What do you think about that? I mean, is there any legitimacy to that approach?
Yeah. Well, in fact, Dominic, it's where I started when I was trying to envision what I was arguing for by drawing a bunch of Venn diagrams. But it just got too complex. And I was standing there at my desk, and for some reason I thought, if I take my water bottle and this pen holder and this book, and I walk around my desk and look at them from different perspectives, then at some points they'll line up with one another, and at other points sometimes they'll be in between each other, and sometimes one of them will be all the way out at the extreme. And it was then that I thought, oh, actually this might be a better way to talk about it, because the Venn diagram idea is helpful, but it's just too hard for us to visualize once you start adding them all up on one another. And I think what you would end up with in that Venn diagram approach, as you described it, would be something like the pansapientialism idea that I'm very concerned about, because Job is helping people to think about things in a way that is similar to Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, but also helping people to think about things in ways that are similar to to Psalms, as well as in ways that are similar to Lamentations. So now your Venn diagram is being drawn around those texts as well. Now, if you want to include Job firmly in wisdom, then you've got to now expand your wisdom category to also include Psalms and Lamentations. If your other option is to keep it small, then how do you reflect the fact that Job doesn't fit in it completely? Which, I mean, is what I'm trying to get at with this three-dimensional idea, is to say there are ways that Job fits in exactly what you're saying, but there are also ways that it doesn't, without falling into pansapientialism.
Oh, that's awesome, man. The 3D thing is great. I think my question also relates to, there are very similar rhetorical and literary devices in some of this literature that transcend the Bible, wouldn't you say? And a lot of the same metaphors show up in these types of things. So, I mean, we could blame this all on cognitive linguistics. This is just how people think, or we could say there may have actually been a way that people were going about writing concerning certain serious issues.
Sure. And I think this goes back to the first question that Trey asked, which is, I want to try and think about that a little bit more specifically and say, Job is using rhetorical techniques that are similar to the dialogue of pessimism, but Proverbs isn't really doing that, with the exception of the words of augur, perhaps. And so, rather than group them all within wisdom literature, I want to say, okay, this rhetorical technique is shared between Job, dialogue of pessimism, Nemeki, and then other rhetorical techniques are being used by Proverbs and Shirapach and Amenemope. And in that way, be able, I think, to identify more closely what those rhetorical techniques are doing and how they're attempting to achieve what they're doing.
That was a great answer. Thank you, brother.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, maybe a couple more. What?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kynes. Really interesting presentation. If it's okay, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about how you see this working out in the classroom. So I teach some high schoolers and middle schoolers every now and then, and I've used wisdom literature as a category, so I'm guilty. But can you just talk a little bit more about whether or not you think that's a useful category in the classroom, what you would use to replace it? And I'm even thinking a little bit more like in a church context, or if you're teaching kids, you want to use categories that are concrete, help people latch on to things. So just how have you tried to apply that, as you teach and try to explain this to others?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This whole project was actually inspired when I was at St. Andrews doing my MLit, and I was doing some research on Job, and I was listening to some sermons by a pastor that I greatly respect. I won't mention his name, but I really respect him. But I could hear in his introduction to Job, the sermon he did at the beginning of Job, he was just saying the same stuff that I was reading in 19th century historical criticism about, well, if we're going to read Job, we have to recognize that it's part of wisdom literature, and wisdom literature is more humanistic and universalistic and rationalistic than the rest of the Old Testament. And so, and it doesn't deal as much with Israel's law or Israel's history. So he's using all of that stuff, which as I was digging deeper into the origins of wisdom literature, I realized that's just imposed on the text by these historical critics. And so the first thing I'd want to do in a teaching or a preaching context is throw all of those presuppositions out. And instead, I'd want to pay more attention to the ways that these texts do relate to Israel's theology, Israel's law, Israel's history. If I was preaching on Proverbs 1-9, then I would want to pay attention to the role that Deuteronomy plays in Proverbs 1-9, which gets completely overlooked because Deuteronomy is not wisdom literature and Proverbs is. Or if I'm preaching on Job, I want to pay attention to the ways that Job is drawing on lament traditions and even specific psalms from the book of Psalms, which is what I argued in my PhD dissertation. And so when I teach in class on the writings, and I follow the Jewish divisions of the canon, when I teach on the writings, I intentionally don't group Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job together. Instead, I group Job with Lamentations as a way to think about the similarities between those two books. And I group Ecclesiastes and Proverbs with Psalms. Now, I don't know if there are any canon lists that do it that way, but what I'm trying to do is intentionally develop within my students the ability to read intertextually and follow some of these contours across the canon that can illuminate the texts in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate those thoughts.
Sure.
All right, maybe one more question. Nope, everybody's good. Okay. Hey, well, let's give Dr. Kynes a round of applause for being here. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope we get to meet each other in person, run into each other at conferences this November.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much. And if you all have any more questions, feel free to send me an email. It's just wkynes@Samford. Love to engage with you all.
All right. Have a good one.
All right, bye.